Hi folks, Rob Goller here. Thanks for joining me again for this week's chat about local history. This week's topic comes from a friend of mine who doesn't know I'm talking about this today, but hopefully she'll be watching. Many of you who are from East Aurora know Rachel Francis. She's written a lot about local history, but she posted the other day about voting trends and how women actually didn't vote when they were given the right to back in nationwide in 1920. And this intrigued me because I've written quite a bit about voting, women's suffrage locally, and the impact of these national movements here locally and on small towns, especially in our region. So I was intrigued by this, and I had done a little bit of research about it, but I delved into the numbers a little bit more, inspired again by Rachel's post about whether or not women actually took advantage of the right to vote. And short answer is they didn't. Not a lot did, surprisingly. We would think that the numbers would double after women were granted the right to vote. That sufficient equal number of women would want to go to the polls and vote once they were given that very hard fought right. And we have to remember that right to vote they've been attempting to that for nearly a century. It started before the Civil War, of course, and here in New York State, it was granted in 1917, nationwide in 1920. And here locally, I've written about it quite a bit, talked about it quite a bit, as we had a very active women's suffrage movement, thanks in part to Alice Hubbard and the Roycrofters, who were very pro women's suffrage. And unfortunately, Alice Hubbard died in 1915 aboard the Lusitania. Never got to see the fruits of her labor realized. Susan B. Anthony the same. So a lot of people who worked on this movement never lived long enough to see it actually come into fruition. So that makes it a little interesting that this right that had been fought for so long was not actually taken advantage of by many women. And the numbers locally, and I wanted to look locally again. That slide that Rachel showed on her social media page about the voting patterns and how women weren't voting. That's what happened here in East Aurora, and you'll probably see it in small towns across New York State, across the country. So I took a look at uh, November 1917 is when the men voted to allow women to vote in New York State, granting women's suffrage. They had also voted 2 years earlier in 1915, and it had failed, and then it came back up and was approved in November of 1917. So the first election that women were allowed to vote in, they had been allowed to vote in school board elections, not just here, but in other areas of the country, because the school was seen as women's domain, whether that's right or wrong. And so they were granted some suffrage in some places and in some instances. But the first government election that women were allowed to vote in after the November 1917 enactment of statewide women's voting rights was in the spring of 1918, and it was the village board elections, and those are held in the spring. And the Easter Advertiser, the local newspaper, noted that the turnout was higher, probably because more women were voting, and they actually were impressed at the number of women that had voted, but they didn't really delineate how many women had shown up. But what is really telling are the November elections, and again, one would suspect that if on paper you would think that the amount of votes, people showing up to the polls, would double, because there are 50% women, 50% men, and if you're opening up voting to 50% of the population who couldn't vote before, you would think that the vote would double. And that's not what happened. In November of 1917, I just looked at some of the numbers, there were 961 votes tallied in the town of Aurora. November of 1918, which would be the first November election that women were allowed to vote in, it was 1,282. So 961 to 1,282. So it didn't double, not even close. And then in November of 1919, it went back to down to 971. Now we have to remember that some of these elections are presidential years and non-presidential years, and so that does impact it, or congressional years, and some are just local town elections, which the turnout would be different. But still, one would think the numbers would be higher, and that women would be swarming to the polls in order to vote, and that isn't what happened. Um, and actually, the 1918 election was on par with the 1914 election 4 years earlier. So similar elections. 997 in 1914, 971 in 1918. So um, the numbers didn't increase that much in the 4 years, with women's suffrage being granted in between there, which was kind of shocking. Uh, the 1920, the 1919 village election. So the newspaper pointed out that a large share of women came to vote in the 1918 village election. The following year, an interesting thing happened. Uh, there were 90 votes cast, which wasn't a lot. They actually noted how the election was a very low turnout that year. There wasn't a lot on the ballot. And 90 votes were cast. And how many women voted? Two. So out of 90 votes cast in 1919, two women voted, um, according to the report in the newspaper. So that shocked me a little bit, that you would think more than two women would show up. But again, women were granted the right to vote, and they didn't take advantage of it. Many didn't. Surprisingly, though, the next year in 1920, there appears to have been a write-in campaign for a woman. So perhaps the 1919 election was sort of a wake-up call. 25 votes were cast for a woman, presumably a write-in, in the 1920 village election. Um, un- uh, Throughout this period, in the 20s, the voting started to pick up, but it's hard to tell if it was women voting more or our population was really drastically increasing at that point. Um, we had in 1920, a presidential election, 1,850 people voted. 1924, over 3,000 people voted. More people were voting, and I think more women were voting, but it took some time for women to take advantage of their new right. It wasn't immediate. People weren't flocking to the polls, and it took a long time, as you will read other places, nationwide, for the turnout of women voters to catch up to those of men. Another thing that happened that was interesting is it took a long time for women to run for office. Yes, 1920 we had some write-ins for a woman, but efforts for a woman to run for village board here in the village of East Aurora, they they tried in the 1930s to get a woman to run. I've written about that, and they just couldn't find interest. There were actually a group of women in town who were trying to get a candidate, the woman's candidate, and they couldn't get someone to run. Actually, our first village trustee and our first female village trustee and our first female town board member came in the 1970s. So it took that long to get someone to run successfully. And of course, that was a period of time of the women's liberation movement, and women were seen more as it's not right, but we're seen as capable of those jobs and willing to run for those jobs. And I had heard in some instances, there was one great story I had heard about a woman who actually ran and won for a seat on their local village board, and they refused to bring a pen with them to the meeting because they didn't want anyone else to think they were be the ones to take the minutes or take the notes. There was still that idea. Young people today don't seem to understand how that male and female roles were so ingrained. Some of it's still with us, ingrained in how boardrooms worked, both in the private and public sector, so that it took that long for women to seek and win seats on our local boards, town and village. Again, school boards were a little different. Women, that was seen more as the realm for mothers and women. But village and towns, it took for a much longer period of time to get people to run. Um, why weren't women voting after they were granted the right to vote? Well, there are a couple theories that I have. The research that I've done over the years um, uh, tends to answer the question, I think. First off, a lot of women weren't in favor of women voting. It might seem shocking today, but lots of uh, newspaper articles at the time that were asking people's opinion. And a lot of women felt that the women's place was at home with the children, not involved in politics. A lot of people thought that women would just vote how their husbands told them to vote. So it would defeated the purpose of having women to vote because it would just be two votes for their husband rather than a separate vote for them. So one of the reasons is a lot of women didn't feel that it was, even though we hear a lot about women trying to win the right to vote, there was a whole other sector of women who didn't agree and didn't feel that women should actually go vote. So even though they were granted the right to vote, a lot of women didn't feel it was their place to vote. Um, it's just a reality. It seems terrible to think of that today in today's standards, but back then that's how a lot of women felt. They felt that their place was not in the polling booth. A second reason was voting is was intimidating. It sometimes still is, and you'll see me point out a lot about the lack of. It's one of my pet peeves when you go to vote. There doesn't seem to. There's not a lot of security. There's security, secrecy. And privacy when you vote in some cases. I wish there was more. That's just one of my personal pet peeves when you walk in and someone can walk behind you and see how you're voting. As an aside, you can actually ask to go use a more private booth. So if you're ever uncomfortable, they actually have more private booths to vote in. So please do that if you feel intimidated. Um, but voting should not be intimidating. And back then, they had just rolled out about 20 years earlier, and here in Aurora, but in other towns, slowly rolling out the voting machine that we had used for decades. And the curtain that closed, you pulled the lever, curtain closed. You weren't filling out a paper ballot and putting it into a scanner. You were actually voting on this voting machine where the curtain closed. And for a lot of new voters, mostly women at the time, this was an intimidating thing. And the League of Women Voters and other groups actually held training sessions to show you how to vote. Because imagine you are a woman and you've never voted before. And you are learning about candidates, you're learning about issues. A lot of women were involved, even though they couldn't vote. They'd attend the town meetings, and they would, especially when it came to temperance and prohibition and issues like that. But they had never been able to go to the voting booth. And so they were never taught how to use a voting booth machine and how to vote. And so the League of Women Voters was and other groups were having classes essentially, and the Board of Elections you could go to the town hall and the voting places in advance the Saturday before Election Day to do a practice run through the voting machine. So this was they realized that this was a problem. However, a lot of women still were intimidated by this whole process. And number two, it took time for people to do this educational effort. So even though women were granted the right to vote in 1917, they didn't immediately rush out to vote. Getting over that intimidation and getting used to the system took some time. So that might be part of the reason why it took a little while for women to become accustomed to vote. So a lot of women didn't want to vote to begin with, and then even if they did want to vote, it was rather intimidating to use the machines and all that sort of thing. And lastly, one of the other reasons I came upon, and this was in 1940s, World War One or World War Two, excuse me, World War Two, that this was happening. So 2 decades after women were given the right to vote, more than 2 decades after, a lot of women were not showing up to the polls. They were not registering to vote because when you went to go register to vote, you had to uh, give your age. They actually asked for your age on your voting form. And back then, maybe still today, but back then more so, women were not willing to tell people their age. And you had to actually go into this room and register by stating out loud to the registrar your information. and women were intimidated by to do that, and some of them didn't even want to write it down on the card, even though the card may have been kept private. No one would have seen the card necessarily. So a lot of women stayed away, and this was an article that was published in the Advertiser and in local newspapers around the state and around the country at that point, where women were asked their age, and that was too much for them, so they didn't vote. And so what they ended up doing is change. They've discovered that they didn't need, by the law, they didn't need to ask for your age. They just had to. You just had to test a test that you were over 21 at that point. You had to be 21 to vote, and so you just attested that you were over 21. They didn't ask for your exact age. So that may be one of the reasons why women weren't voting, is a simple question, and this was proven by articles in the newspaper. So the registration levels were low for women just because they were asked their age. So that may be one of the reasons. Good news is it took a long time, but women are voting more than men typically, and so they are using their right to vote more so than they have before. However, we can always do better, of course. Everyone should be voting, and we should never take the right for granted. And it seems interesting to me that um, for so long, women and their supporters, and it wasn't just women in the women's suffrage movement, a lot of men were a part of it too, fought so long, and then they get the right, and almost immediately are taking it for granted. And we sometimes don't want to think of it that way, but it's true. The numbers show that women were not taking advantage of their right to vote. And today, a lot of us don't take for granted. We take it for granted, and we just don't go vote. One of my opinions is that we need to, voting has become complicated. We have early voting today, and so we're bombarded with a lot of information. But it's our responsibility to look up and make sure we know when we're supposed to vote and who's on the ballot and look at the issues. And it's so much easier to vote today than it has ever been before. There's early voting. There's other ways to vote, and in our state especially, it is easier. In other states, perhaps not. But we have the right to vote, and we should use that right, and and learn from that history. After 1920, we look back on the. I fell into the trap of looking back on women of after 1917, early 1920s, and be like, what was wrong with them? They fought so long for the right to vote, and they wouldn't vote. But then we can't. We're sort of in a glass house about it because many of us don't vote, and so we can't really judge the women of 1920 when we're kind of doing the same thing today. So lessons to be learned from this history is vote, vote, vote. If we are appalled by the fact that not enough women were voting after they gained suffrage, gained voting rights in 1917, we should be voting today to make sure that what they've done, what they did back then, is not in vain. That people fought for a really long time to vote. It also is interesting. We have a right today, even though we all should be voting, we have a right not to vote. In some countries, there's mandatory voting. They want to make sure everybody's voice is heard, but your voice is heard if you don't vote. So you're sort of saying, I don't want to vote. But then, they like they say, you can't complain if you aren't part of the process. So it's our duty to actually look up the issues, what people are talking about, where they stand on things, not only at the national level but the local level as well. And that was apparent in the village elections here when women were given. I find it very interesting that the first election that women were able to vote in here in East Aurora back in 1918 was the government closest to the people, and that was the village. So I thought that was quite interesting. We sometimes talk about women's suffrage in presidential elections and Congress and the federal level, when in fact that the first election that women were able to vote in here was the village, our little village board, the government closest to the people. So I found that very interesting. Thanks, Rachel Francis, for this great idea. She doesn't know that I grabbed the idea from her, but I appreciate being thinking about it, being that idea being put in my head, and it seemed appropriate this week as we celebrate freedom on the 4th of July. So enjoy Independence Day, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for keeping history alive, and as always, if you have any comments, questions, topic ideas, pop them either in the comments or send me a private message. Again, I'm Rob Goller. I'm the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and a lot of my research are not connected officially with my duties as Town and Village Historian, and I appreciate all the support you give this project. Again, keep the comments coming, and thank you for keeping history alive here in our community and across the country. And please vote. Thanks. Have a good one. See you next time.